Mr. Joseph Patrouch, who's going to talk to us, who is, of course, the director of the Wirth Institute at the University of Alberta, where he is full professor. He is a remarkable person, and certainly just talking to him now, I've actually figured out that he does a lot, and he even actually does a lot more than I do, which is, to me, amazing. I mean, not only is he full professor and director of the Institute, he earned his BA with honors at Boston University, and then MA and PhD in history at University of California, Berkeley. He is an expert on the Habsburg Empire, and that means the whole darn thing, which means how far it covers all over the world and has covered, not just only at its apex in the Renaissance and the Baroque era, but also beyond. He has just in fact taught a compressed course on the Habsburgs from the 10th to the 20th century, where he was in Jerusalem, I believe it was. And he was at Hebrew University, that's correct, and also before that he has done research at the University of Vienna, and a fair amount of historical research. So,
history of this particular performance into the history of the city of Vienna itself. The neighborhood Wieden is now incorporated into Vienna as the 4th district. For those of you who know Vienna, the 4th district is the district in which the Freihaus Theater was located. It was one of the fastest growing neighborhoods in Vienna in the late 19th century, situated on the banks of the Vienna River, around the area which would develop into one of Vienna's largest produce markets, the one that we now know as the Naschmarkt. So if you know Vienna and the Naschmarkt, that's the general area we're talking about, this neighborhood in which this performance first occurred. Wieden included mills and their trashy mill stream, some early textile factories, a smattering of new religious houses, and of course the impressive and curious-looking massive church dedicated to St. Charles Borromeo, the Karlskirche, which had been completed on the edge of Wieden, closest to the old city, about a half a century before Mozart's piece premiered. In addition to all this early modern urban sprawl, Wieden was home to the massive Freihaus complex, which is said to have had 6 separate courtyards and over 30 stairwells. The Freihaus Theater, where Magic Flute debuted, was situated in this multi-use development, which included around 1,000 apartments. The revenue-producing massive piece of real estate, probably Vienna's largest in this period, was owned by an important Austrian noble family, the Starhembergs, and this family was involved in rebuilding and expanding the Freihaus complex after it had been severely damaged by fire a few decades before Mozart's Magic Flute was first performed there. So situate this in a theater in this massive real estate development with all these tenements and complex relationships between stairways and courtyards. The Starhembergs were a family with deep roots in the Austrian land, and a family which would continue to play a role in Austrian politics well into the 20th century. In Mozart's time, the members of the family played key roles at the imperial court. The Starhemberg family, like a number of noble families in the 18th century, obtained property in the Wieden neighborhood and built a garden palace there. So there's a number of these garden palaces around the Freihaus complex too. In addition to owning the Freihaus complex, which was therefore tax exempt, that's why it's called Freihaus, it's free from taxation because it's a noble family that owns it. The Starhembergs resided from time to time in the neighborhood in Wieden where this theater was located. The Freihaus Theater, where Magic Flute debuted, was closed a decade after the premiere. The surrounding residential complex was torn down last century, and now one of the major buildings of the Technical University of Vienna occupies much of the site and is known as Freihaus. If you wander the neighborhood today, and in preparation for today's talk, when I was in Vienna recently, I wandered around the neighborhood looking at the area, trying to imagine what it was like back in the time of Mozart, 1791. You can still find some traces of the Magic Flute. Even though the Freihaus is gone, has been incorporated into TU, into the Technical University, you can see, for example, a square and a fountain named after Mozart, and an alley named after Emanuel Schekeneder, the librettist. There's also an apartment building which was built in 1937, known as the Papageno House. So if you know the performance, you can wander around, Papageno, because over this 1937 apartment building door is a statue of Papageno, featuring a small sculpture there of him. This brief introduction to the neighborhood in which the magic flute was first performed is meant to help explain some of the characteristics of the piece, as we already heard. The literary scholar Wolbert Spatling has described the libretto as, quote, a bewildering piece of literature. At its best, a rich source of folklore and popular enlightenment. At its worst, an unoriginal patchwork of disparate scenes and motifs hastily strung together and modishly designed for instant success. We are dealing with a literary conglomerate, unquote. That's what this is, a literary conglomerate. I'd like to suggest that this bewildering patchwork, this bewitching conglomerate, was also a reflection of the busy and diverse Wieden Freihaus, a place where court-connected nobles mixed with semi-educated clerics and unwashed mill hands. Although some of the specific characteristics of the piece may not be as apparent in this production, which I understand has a certain Bollywood flair, I don't want to give anything away, and an indeterminate setting, I'd like to sketch out tonight 3 themes which I think can be seen as reflections of the magic flute's historical contexts in a crowded popular theater on the outskirts of the Austrian capital in 1791. 3. These 3 themes are, 1, a concern for the political developments in Austria and France at the time. 2, ongoing uneasiness and debates about the role of women in politics, and this was also already mentioned in the comments. And 3, a fascination with, as well as fear or wonder at the Islamic world, or perhaps at the Middle East, or the Orient in general, at a time shortly after a major bloody war against the Ottoman Empire had just ended less than 2 months before the premiere. A massive war had been going on for years, thousands, tens of thousands of dead in this war against the Ottomans. The peace treaty signed just months before the premiere of the Magic Flute in September of 1791. The Holy Roman Empire, of which Austria and Vienna were significant parts in this period, had very recently undergone some jarring changes. And word in the local press was that the Allied Kingdom of France, as well as the Austrian-ruled territories bordering it to the north, now basically Belgium and Luxembourg, which were ruled by the same family as ruled in Austria, were undergoing major political transformations. As many of you no doubt already know, the Austrian Archduchess Maria Antonia and her husband Louis, the King of France, had been caught trying to flee the country just 3 months before the performance, before the Magic Flute's premiere, only to be caught and brought back to Paris, where, after tense negotiations in September of 1791, the king agreed to accept a written constitution. On the very day of the Vienna premiere of the Magic Flute, the French National Constituent Assembly voted to dissolve itself. A tense moment. The National Assembly voted to dissolve itself to be replaced by the short-lived Legislative Assembly under the Constitution of 1791, setting up a kind of constitutional monarchy, which of course, as you know, would last for less than a year. But at that moment, it's a very important political moment in the history of Europe. The French Revolution is getting underway, but it's not the French Revolution that we remember. The guillotining, bloody French Revolution. It's the constitutional revolution that took place before. That's the context of this Magic Flute, not the guillotine context. Discussions of political change were in the air in Vienna that late September evening when Papageno and company first walked on stage. This is not only because of what was going on in France. The French Queen's brother, Leopold, had been elected the Holy Roman Emperor a year ago to the day. The day of the premiere was the 1-year anniversary of the election of Emperor Leopold to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. And the hope and expectations in Vienna and throughout the Austrian lands and throughout the Holy Roman Empire were high that Leopold would rule in a more enlightened and less ham-handed way than his brother Joseph II, who had passed away the year before. You may remember Joseph II from the old movie that we've talked about, Amadeus. He plays a big role in that. He was the major patron, right, of Mozart, and he had just passed away. His younger brother takes over. Joseph II passed away without direct heirs after a controversy-filled reign, and the new emperor, Leopold, had developed a good reputation in Florence as the ruler of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Not only was the premiere of the Magic Flute exactly on the 1-year anniversary of Leopold's election, but as we've already heard, Just a bit more than 3 weeks before another Mozart production, his opera La Clemenza di Tito, had premiered in that other important Central European and Habsburg capital, Prague, to celebrate Leopold's coronation there as King of Bohemia. So I'm saying that Mozart is very interested in supporting the idea of Leopold coming in as the new enlightened ruler, paralleling what's going on in France at the time, right, in 1791. 1791 was a politically loaded year, and many intellectuals, artists, and politicians were grappling with issues relating to politics and rule. In addition to discussions about the proper role of rulers, as reflected in debates related to what historians have come to know as the Enlightenment, the influence of Freemasonry, as we've already heard, on some of the imagery and ideas of magic flute is relatively well known. But I would like to draw your attention tonight as well to the possible influences of debates over the roles of women in politics as you watch this flamboyant piece performed by the Edmonton Opera. The 18th century had been a tumultuous one for the dynasty ruling in Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. A bit more than 50 years before the Magic Flute's premiere, the last male representative of that dynasty, the Habsburgs, had died, leaving his daughter, the Archduchess Maria Theresa, to rule in his place. For 300 years, every Holy Roman Emperor had been a Habsburg. And now, because that office was not open to women, a member of a rival dynasty took over as emperors. No more Habsburgs. A Wittelsbach, by the way, for those of you following at home, which family is ruling in Austria. What a tumult ensued! Who was eligible to rule, and why? Could women inherit political power? War broke out, and thousands died in a messy series of conflicts conveniently now labeled as the War of the Austrian Succession. Representatives of the Austrian Habsburg dynasty understandably retrenched and reevaluated their position, choosing to reinforce those claims most likely to be defended militarily and retreating, at least for a few years, from those most easily challenged. No need to get into the history of the dynasty right now. If you're interested, I teach courses on this. As you know, I just finished a mini course at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem about it. I'd be happy to talk about how this fits into the general history of the dynasty. But it's a very significant moment when they have to retrench and fall back on women's hereditary rights through the position of Maria Theresa. This is neither the time nor the place to go into all the consequences of next year's female-led rule in Central Europe. The Habsburg Archduchess Maria Theresa would become hereditary ruler of Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, and would see her husband elected emperor, thereby earning her the title empress, but by marriage, not by election or by birth. So when you think of Empress Maria Theresa, that is not her position by her own hereditary situation. It's her position by being married to the guy who's elected emperor. For my purpose tonight, I would only suggest that as you listen and watch the upcoming performance of the Magic Flute, you listen and look for evidence of this ongoing debate about the role of women and authority in late 18th century European society. My third and final theme today deals with the general fascination with things Oriental, in quotation marks, and exotic in Viennese popular culture in the late 18th century. In some ways, this should of course not in any way seem surprising. Vienna and Austria had stood on the eastern borders of the Holy Roman Empire. I guess it's an appropriate expression after talking about women and authority. Vienna and Austria had stood on the eastern borders of the Holy Roman Empire for quite some time. In the year of the Magic Flute's premiere, the military rivalry between the Christian Habsburg rulers of Austria and the Muslim rulers of the rival Ottoman Empire had been bitterly battled on and off for the better part of 3 centuries. 300 years of battles have been going on between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. But familiarity, in this case at least, does not seem to have bred contempt. On the contrary, in Vienna, and I can't speak to the situation in the Ottoman capital of Constantinople or Istanbul, the fascination with and appeal of things Oriental, things exotic, and things Eastern seemed to grow with each passing year. Mozart's popular Magic Flute speaks and sings to this interest in things Egyptian, things Eastern, things magical. It's taken to some extent from stories assembled a few years before by the German writer Christoph Martin Wieland, dealing with a fantastical Genististan, or Genie Land, full of wonderful and magical stories of spirits and heroes and spinning around familiar magical objects. which remind one of worlds filled with flying carpets and magic lamps. In the Zauberflöte, Mozart, and even more his librettist, gave us a magic glockenspiel to go along with the more famous magic flute, the world of these famous magical objects. But behind the happy tones of a birdman and his plumed partner, in the musical singing game, or Singspiel as it was known, the magic flute, behind all of that stood a brutal reality, which stands as the third and final theme to remember as you contemplate this piece as it's performed in the next couple of weeks. In 1783, 8 years before the premiere of the magic flute, the Pomeranian-born Russian Tsarina Yekaterina, often known in Anglophone literature as Catherine II or Catherine the Great, another very important female ruler at the time period and an ally of the Habsburgs in Austria, Katerina had authorized the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. Sound familiar? The annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia affected an affiliated part of the Ottoman Empire. Fearing the consequences of acquiescence to Russian aggression, the Ottoman Sultan responded in 1787 with a declaration of war. The Austrian hereditary ruler, Maria Theresa's son Joseph, had agreed to a defensive alliance with the Tsarina and chose to massively mobilize his lands in response to the Ottomans' declaration. I think in the original negotiations he had promised 13,000 troops. In the total mobilization, it ended up being over 300,000 men who were mobilized by the Austrian Habsburgs to go fight in this war against the Ottomans. This led to the last of what some count as 8 major wars between the Habsburgs of Austria and their imperial rivals, the Ottomans. In the years leading up to the premiere of the Magic Flute, lifelong male conscription and increasingly draconian war taxes, often levied at up to 50% higher rates than previously, resulted in mass draft evasion, self-mutilations and desertions, not to mention bread riots, such as those that were seen in the Vienna suburbs in July of 1788. Suburbs like Viennese, right, where the play is performed. It was only with the successful capture of the Ottoman border fortress in Belgrade in October of 1789 that the public mood in Vienna swung, at least temporarily, in the direction of support for this war. The city was illuminated with thousands of torches to celebrate the success. This victory recalled the successful relief of the siege by Ottoman forces of the city of Vienna a bit over a century before. Vienna had been besieged in 1683 by Ottoman forces, and this is kind of remembering of the successful defense of the city and prosecution of the war in Belgrade. Then the war continued. The Emperor Joseph died, probably from TB contracted while at the front, and his younger brother Leopold was left to organize a halfway honorable peace. This peace, as I already mentioned, was signed less than 2 months before the Magic Flute's premiere in the Freihaustheater in September of 1791. So when one listens to and watches Mozart's famous Magic Flute, one should keep in mind that it was produced in magical and complicated contexts. These contexts included the vibrant, lively Wieden suburb of Vienna and its short-lived Freihaustheater, and the massive mixed-use real estate development run by the Starhemberg family. These contexts also include the politically charged debates about the ongoing French Revolution and the Enlightenment as these were played out in Central Europe. Another important context to remember is the context of the debates about female rule, coming as they did after decades of competent and successful government by that last Habsburg, the Empress Queen Maria Theresa. And finally, the anxious context of the continuing and bloody confrontation with the Ottoman Empire should be recalled as elements of Middle Eastern, Japanese, and even prehistoric Iranian cultures and their imagined representatives are brought to the fairy tale stage by Mozart and his imaginative collaborator Chickinator.